Hello, today I'm going to talk with you about what role communities play in helping prevent child abuse and neglect. Reports of child abuse or neglect do not have to be made by mandated reporters or even social workers. A lot of abuse and neglect reports are made by regular members of the community. Some reports have been made by interns, optometrists, chiropractors, and even anonymous callers. When it comes to preventing child abuse and neglect, it's not one group's responsibility, but the entire community's responsibility to keep their children safe. The first step is creating a community in which parents and children feel safe to live. I believe one problem in communities' role in preventing child abuse and neglect is that people think that if you build more community centers, everything will solve itself. The community centers that are in place are not always being utilized, and people who may need help are not reaching out for it. Some people tend to think that if you give people a place to go, their problems will just disappear and they'll go get them solved. If only it were that easy. There's an article in Project Muse published by Princeton University written by Deborah Darrow and Kenneth A. Hodge. These authors have focused on directly improving the skills of parents who are currently engaged in maltreatment or are at risk for it. The authors examined 5 different community prevention efforts in the last 10 years and came to the conclusion that intervention at the neighborhood level is likely to prevent child maltreatment. However, it is very expensive. But what is the real cost when it comes to preventing child abuse and neglect in the community? PhD Cynthia Conrad published an article titled Measuring Costs of Child Abuse and Neglect, a mathematic model of specific cost estimations, that talks about direct and indirect costs that child abuse and neglect has on the community. Conrad states, direct costs are those associated with the treatment of abused and neglected children, as well as the cost of family intervention programs or foster care. Indirect costs are costs to society created by negative effects of child abuse and neglect by individuals who suffer such abuse, and then as teens or adults engage in criminal behavior. Indirect costs also derive from the long-term and ongoing healthcare needs required by victims of abuse or neglect. Conrad proves that this is less costly for the community to build a center than it is to treat individuals from neglect and abuse for the rest of their lives. She has a valid point when she states that you cannot put a price on a child's safety and security. Okay, so even if you put a community center in a bad neighborhood, is it going to be successful? Darrow and Dodge found that neighborhoods do have an effect on family and child behaviors and outcomes, including parenting behaviors. They state that community norms frame what parents may view as appropriate or essential ways to interact with their children. And that sets the standard as to how and when parents would seek help from others if necessary. So really, we are all learning from one another and depending on one another, even as adults. I think a lot of people have similar problems and they don't realize this, and that's where the community can come together in the least costly and most time efficient way is by simply being there for one another. Most communities have small group meetings available where people can go and share their stories, but it's very secluded and frowned upon in most societies. Darrow and Dodge tested whether holding parent trainings in large grouped community settings versus smaller groups in clinics. They wanted to see which one would attract more people. The parents who attended the community groups reported greater involvement on difficult behavior in their children. What they found was that in a community-based group, there was enhanced participation of some immigrant families whose parents did not speak English. These families may not have come forward for a small meeting with others who were not like them, but because we opened up to each other on a bigger scale, we realized that we can help each other and prevent child abuse and neglect in the community. Darrow and Dodge then looked into why neighborhoods that share a common socioeconomic profile can have different levels of maltreatment. They found that the community with higher rates of maltreatment reports was less socially integrated. It also experienced less positive neighboring and more stressful day-to-day interactions. I quote, "On all dimensions, residents of the community with the greatest increase in maltreatment rates expressed the most negative views of their community, knew the littlest about existing community services or agencies, and demonstrated little evidence of a formal or informal social support network." So how can we get people who need help to reach out for it before abuse and neglect starts? If community morale is low, what can we do to make it better? We cannot change the people who live there, but we can change the environment that they live in. This is where the community can step in and help each other before things get out of hand. By educating your community on what is considered abuse and what is considered neglect, and by offering an outlet to parents or guardians who are feeling overwhelmed. Martha Morrison Dorr and Judy M. Lee wrote an article titled "The Role of Parent Training with Abusive and Neglectful Parents." In this article, there are several case studies that are conducted showing different types of training that is offered to abusive and neglectful parents. The authors state that some interventions try to change poor parenting skills for good, and some of them try to prevent them before they ever happen. But which ones are successful? Unfortunately, their study could not prove which treatment was more successful in terms of abuse and neglect rates, but they could increase their knowledge on which programs were more beneficial to families as a whole. Dorr and Lee started by gathering parents who had already been previously identified as abusive or neglectful. They then narrowed them down into categories of maltreatment parents, parents of children with behavioral problems, and the general population of parents. In the general population, they hypothesized that this group would include some who would be at risk for future maltreatment. They looked at 5 programs currently offered to communities and found that some programs focused on the family as a whole and some programs focused on the parents as individuals. The programs that focused on the parents as individuals usually focused on parent behavior training, which helped to improve the parents' self-esteem and reduce their stress. These programs also focused on parent-mediated behavior and how to enhance child compliance without doing harm. The programs that focused on families as a whole often focused on how parents could interact and help their children learn, how to play with their child, how to set limits and rewards, how to offer praise, and how to support communication with children. The family interaction programs would also practice healthy child and parent interactions such as involved instruction and role-playing, so that professionals could see what was going wrong and where to fix it. In comparing all these programs, they had hoped to find which one was most successful in hopes of integrating it into communities that need help with child abuse and neglect. Dorr and Lee found that parents who were learning to identify their children's needs started to also be able to identify their own needs in response of those of their children, thus developing a sense of self-understanding. They found that once the parent understood where their frustrations were coming from, it made it easier not to take it out on the child. The American Psychological Association states that the main reasons adults hurt children is because they lose their temper when they get mad about their own problems, they don't know how to discipline the child, they expect more from the child than is realistic for their age or ability, they've been abused themselves by a parent or a partner, they have financial problems, or they lose control due to drugs and alcohol. As a community, if we can help eliminate some of these issues for parents or caretakers, our child and neglect rates should decrease. The last thing that we can do as a community to prevent child abuse and neglect is to treat each other with kindness. In a study done in 1994 by Susan Shira from the New York Times titled "Benefits in Emotional Control," she finds that when parents pay attention to emotions, they convey it unconsciously, and they unconsciously force their children to learn self-awareness and self-control. This later proved to have a positive outcome on how these children scored academically compared to other parents who were not very attentive. This was also proven in a study done in 2013 by Bridget Schulte titled "Stillface." She proved that children are always absorbing new information from those around them, even before they are aware of their own consciousness. They're learning about emotions and intentions from the minute they arrive on this earth. In the experiment on the screen, this is a mother and her child. They asked the mother to engage with the baby and interact as normal. They watched as the baby mimicked the mother and interacted back. They then asked the mother to stop interacting with the baby. They saw that the baby desperately tried to get the mother's attention back by flailing its arms and reaching towards the mother. The mother had no response towards this. When the baby saw that, the baby got upset and began to cry, but the mother did not reciprocate any sort of a response. The mother would then engage and start playing with the baby again, and the baby would go back to being happy and content. This proves that when children grow up in a home with abuse or neglect, even if they're just babies, it affects their outlook on life. It affects the way they handle emotions and see intentions. In conclusion, the community's role in preventing child abuse is to create a community where parents and children feel safe and secure. Find the money, donate if you have to, but build the centers and provide the trainings that are proven successful in helping parents understand themselves and their children. And lastly, educate. Make sure the community has a clear and concise picture of what abuse and neglect looks like and how to prevent it. By standing together and taking these steps, we can help end child abuse and neglect in our communities.